together tonight of history and art. Over the last, several weeks, we have been enjoying a very central theme, but expressed through music, art, and now through history. This is a very important date today. And so we will, in a way, experience what took place about 79 years ago. Let me read a piece to help us prepare. I'm sorry, it's Friday, isn't it? Okay. 79 years ago, a young pastor, theologian, head of an illegal underground seminary in Germany, as he was doing his devotions, he heard news of what had taken place that night. And in the margin of his Bible, he dates it, November the 9th, 1938. The passage of Scripture comes from the Psalms 74, verse 8 and 9. They said in their hearts, we will crush them completely. They burned every place where God was worshipped in the land. And he sent a word to his students of what he saw coming. Tonight we have the honor of participating in this event through Dr. Ed Snyder, chairman of the history department. Ed was born and raised in Buffalo, New York. There he attended Canisius College, a small Jesuit liberal arts college, and in 2002 received his Bachelor of Arts degree in history and German. In 2003, he began graduate study at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and there he earned both an MA and PhD in modern European history before coming here to Chowan in 2014. Dr. Snyder has also held research grants from the Fulbright Program, German Academic Exchange Service, and the Central European History Society. Through these grants, he has conducted research on the Nazi murder of people with disabilities and the resistance of the German Protestant Church to Nazi racial policies. I hope you'll join me in welcoming Dr. Snyder as he shares with us Kristallnacht.
Thank you. So before I begin, I'd first like to thank the School of Graphic Communications and Dean Rupsch for inviting me to speak this evening. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Chowan for the wonderful introduction. And as you all know, this is one of a series of events to celebrate the 65th anniversary of graphic communications at Chowan. So for me, it's a really great honor to be able to be here this evening to participate in these events and to represent both the History Department and the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies. So once again, thank you again for the invitation. This evening, we're all here to celebrate Ali Rogan's amazing work, Kristallnacht, as well as commemorate the anniversary of Kristallnacht, which is maybe known as German for Kristallnacht, which is a significant moment in the larger history of the Holocaust, which was the murder of over 6 million Jews by Nazi Germany. And as many of you know, my scholarly background is in the history of the Third Reich and the history of the Holocaust. And then one of the most frequent questions I get from people is, why am I interested in this particular topic? What kind of drove me to study this aspect of European history? And I think there are many answers to that question, but the one thing that initially sparked my interest in this area is that on the surface, the development of the Holocaust appears to be a very straightforward process. If you look at the history of the Third Reich, it appears as if the Nazis had a clear plan from the moment they took power in 1933, and that their ultimate goal was to kill all of Europe's Jews. However, when you look at the period in greater detail, you quickly realize that it's extraordinarily complex, and that nothing is as clear as it appears on the surface. In many respects, Kristallnacht, both the exhibit and the event itself, illustrate this point perfectly. At the start of 1938, Kristallnacht, I think, was by no means inevitable in Germany. It was the result of several different strands that came together over the course of the year, especially over the course of August, September, and October 1938. At the same time, the aftermath and legacy of this episode is both complicated and enduring. It has a very important, long-lasting legacy. And one of the things I really love about Rogan's work is that it does, I think, an amazing job of trying to grapple with that history and with that legacy. And the work itself, I think, is visually demonstrative of that complexity. Before I discuss that, however, I thought it'd first be helpful for everybody if I just briefly discussed the night itself. And believe it or not, the story of Kristallnacht begins in two locations, neither of which are in Germany. It begins with the border with Poland in the east and with Paris, France. In the summer of 1938, the German government announced that it was canceling the residence permits of foreigners residing in Germany. And the target of this action were 14,000 Polish Jews, many of whom had lived in Germany since the 1920s. Now, worried about the prospect of these Jews returning to Poland, the Polish government responded by passing a law requiring citizens living outside the country to renew their passports, or else lose their right to return. This decree essentially made Polish Jews in Germany stateless. Still, that did not deter Hitler. And in late October, he ordered those Polish Jews living in Germany, those 14,000 people, forcibly deported to Poland. However, having been stripped of their citizenship, Poland refused to accept them. Thus, thousands of people were left stranded on the German-Polish border in extremely harsh conditions. If you've ever been to Europe, or if you've ever been to Eastern Europe, you'll know it's very flat, that especially in November, it gets very cold, very windy, and it's not a fun place to be outside in winter. Now, among those people who were stranded on the border were the parents of a man named Herschel Greenspan, who was living in Paris. And he was extremely upset with the situation. He was extremely upset with what had happened to his parents. So he went to the German embassy and shot a German diplomat named Ernst von Rath. And von Rath died shortly thereafter from the gunshot wounds. So at this point, some of you might be asking, well, how does this all relate and connect back to Kristallnacht? Well, at the time of the assassination, the Nazi Party had gathered in Munich to celebrate the 15th anniversary of the 1923 failed Beer Hall Putsch. The Beer Hall Putsch was an early attempt, a failed attempt by Hitler and the Nazis to seize power by force. And during the preparations for the celebration, the party's propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, received news reports of von Rath's murder, of his assassination. Now I should point out here that Goebbels, at this moment, was in Hitler's doghouse because of an explosive affair he was having with a Czech actress named Lydia Barova. And this marriage this affair threatened to tear his marriage apart. His wife, Magda Goebbels, was extraordinarily upset, went to Hitler, demanding a divorce. For Hitler, this would have been a huge public relations nightmare, and he ordered Goebbels to break off the affair and do whatever he had to do to reconcile and make his marriage work. You'll notice on the left, or excuse me, on the right here, this is an image of Barova, the actress. And on the left, this is an image from the Federal Archives in Germany of Goebbels with his family, 3 of his children, his wife Magda and Hitler, taken shortly after the reconciliation. And Hitler, rumors at this time had swirled that Hitler was so upset with Goebbels over this that he was considering reassigning Goebbels as ambassador to Japan, which was a potentially huge and humiliating demotion. So therefore, Goebbels was desperate to get back into Hitler's good graces. And he knew that Hitler loved big, radical ideas. So he came up with the idea of using von Roth's murder as a pretext to launch a massive wave of violence directed against Germany's Jews. Hitler approved the idea, and other leading Nazi officials quickly got on board. Nobody in the party hierarchy wanted to be on the sidelines for this event. Everybody wanted to find some way to participate in this. So on the night of November 10th, the Nazis unleashed an orgy of violence and destruction as the SA, known as the stormtroopers, translated as the stormtroopers, destroyed Jewish businesses, burned synagogues, and attacked Jews. Now, as many of you probably know, the night got its name from all the glass from the shattered windows that made it appear as if the streets had kind of been paved with crystal. As part of this, the regime also arrested 30,000 Jewish men, held them in concentration camps, and demanded that the Jewish community paid a collective ransom of 1 billion Reichmarks in order to secure their release. Now, admittedly, I think I've discussed the actual events of the night rather quickly. And I want to make sure that I also have time to talk about the legacy of this night and to talk about how I think this evening, this event connects back to Rogan's work. So what I'd say is that before I move on, if you have any questions afterwards, I'm more than happy to get into some of this in greater detail. But I'd like to return to Rogan's work now for a second. I really like the piece, and I was really kind of overwhelmed by it, and I can't tell you how easy it is to just get lost in your thoughts while you're looking at it. And one of the things I really liked about it was the emphasis that it placed on the ideas of renewal and reflection. In other words, Crystal Night urges us to reflect on that night in November 1938 and its importance and its legacy, especially for us today. Now, when I teach about Kristallnacht in class, this is also something that I also try to stress to my students and as part of class. That while the night itself is extremely important, I argue that its real significance happens in what comes next, what happens after that night. So to this end, the first thing I highlight is the reaction of Germans. So I want to show you, I have two images of the actual kind of destruction of the night, but I want to focus on this one. And specifically, I want you to look at the picture on the left. Because when Goebbels proposed his idea, he envisioned everybody joining in with the SA to also commit acts of violence. Instead, almost the exact opposite happens. Most people just stood by and watched, shocked at the violence perpetrated by the regime. And you can see here, this picture illustrates perfectly people just kind of bystanding, watching. This was the first time the regime had ever lashed out publicly, used violence publicly. Some of the officials, some Nazi officials, even went so far as to extinguish fires or protect Jewish synagogues from destruction. To put it not mildly, this was not the reaction that the Nazis had anticipated. And some officials worried that they had overestimated the public's acceptance of Nazi anti-Semitism. As a result, German newspapers provided minimal coverage of the night and purposely kept it off the main headlines in the ensuing days. And I'll just add, this is something that I was really struck by. I did some research in a newspaper archive several years ago in Berlin, and one of the things I did when I was there was I actually requested newspapers from 1938. And I was really amazed at how little attention this got compared to the significance of that event, of that night. So as I tell my students, this is a really important moment that shows how even the most authoritarian governments can be remarkably sensitive to public opinion. Kristallnacht is one of several episodes in the history of the Third Reich where the regime appears to almost back down in the face of negative public reaction. While the reaction of Germans in general is noteworthy, I think the response and what happens to Germany's Jewish community is even more important. One of the things that always surprises my students is how long it took Jews in Germany to realize that they needed to leave the country. Despite years of anti-Semitic legislation, years of legal persecution, most Jews still didn't want to leave Germany. While the laws were bad, life in Germany still appeared to be better than life in Eastern Europe, or even life in neighboring France. If you're familiar with the Dreyfus affair that happened in France in the late 1800s, that was something that was still on the minds of Jews living in Germany. Besides, most Jews, or a number of Jews, thought that it was only a matter of time before Germans came to their senses and got rid of the Nazis. Furthermore, most Jews identify themselves as being German. Hindsight is 20/20. And even in 1938, nobody could have imagined things like gas chambers, mobile death squads, and genocide. And as I tell my students, or as I ask my students, think of everything that goes into moving. Imagine what it would mean for you to suddenly have to pick up, leave everything, and move to Europe. It's stressful, it's frightening, it's time-consuming, and it's really expensive. So if they didn't have to do it, a lot of Jews didn't want to have to leave Germany. But Kristallnacht changes all of that. The public outburst of violence signaled to Jews in Germany that things weren't going to get better, and that they needed to leave immediately. At this point, there's just one problem. Now that Jews realize that they had to get out and are actively trying to leave, nobody is willing to take them in. Nobody's willing to accept them. People like Albert Einstein, who left in 1933, were the exceptions rather than the rule. People who had things that they could offer to other countries were the ones who were able to get out. Most people weren't so lucky, ran into a number of problems. For example, Jews who wanted to immigrate to the United States encountered immigration quotas, a seemingly never-ending maze of bureaucratic red tape, and a general attitude of xenophobia and anti-Semitism. Only those refugees who could provide proof that they had a sponsor willing to support them financially could apply for a visa. And even then, the odds of gaining entry were extraordinarily slim. In order to appear active and concerned, the American government called for an international conference in Evian in 1938, in France, to discuss the refugee crisis. My students, however, are shocked to learn at this conference only one country agreed to open its doors to refugees. I'm honest, does anybody know what that country was? The Dominican Republic.
Really?
Which pledged at the conference to accept 100,000 Jews. In the end, I think only about 800 actually migrated to the Dominican Republic. Now, many of you may also be familiar with the story of a passenger ship named the St. Louis, which departed Germany in early 1939 for Cuba with Jewish refugees. The refugees had all secured visas before they left, these visas would have allowed them to reside in Cuba temporarily until they could legally immigrate into the United States. However, before the ship arrived in Cuba, the Cuban government revoked the visas and denied the refugees entry. The ship sat in Havana Harbor as the crew, as the passengers tried to negotiate entry, but to no avail. Desperate to avoid returning to Europe, the St. Louis subsequently spent a week off the east coast of the United States as the refugees tried to get permission to enter the United States. They were denied, and the ship went back across the Atlantic. And one of the sad things is that subsequent research has, I think, revealed that most of those people who went back to Europe ended up dying in the Holocaust. They were taken in by maybe France, the Netherlands, maybe some by Belgium, but these were all Jews who were eventually recaptured by the Nazis a few years later and then deported out east. In the end, Jews who wanted to escape from Germany really only had one option that would guarantee them asylum. And also, again, does anybody know what the one place they could go relatively easily if they wanted to? Shanghai, China. Due to an immigration loophole dating back to the 19th century, the tied to the legacy of the Opium Wars. European immigrants could not be denied entry into Shanghai. And the Japanese, after taking over China, still honored this provision. So even though the idea of migrating to China appeared daunting, a number of Jews made this trip. Nearly all of them survived the war. They all survived the war. I mean, none of them were killed as part of the Holocaust. And they built a thriving community in Shanghai. Sorry, I'm behind on my images. That lasted until Mao Zedong and the communists seized power as part of the Communist Revolution. Now, as I was thinking about the plight of Jewish refugees after 1938, I constantly returned to Rogan's work, Kristallnacht. And when viewing it, Rogan asks that we use the opportunity to reflect, to think about the racism and anti-Semitism that shaped the plight of so many thousands of people in the wake of November 1938. And as we reflect on the damage caused by these ideas, she asks that we think about how we encounter these ideas of hatred today. And I think this last request is particularly important. As I was writing and reflecting on the legacy of Kristallnacht, I couldn't help but think about relatively recent things like the refugee crisis, involving people who were trying to escape from war-torn Syria. Or more recently, the riots caused by white supremacists in Charlottesville, Virginia. I was struck by the parallels between these events and Kristallnacht in Germany. The plight of Syrian refugees is remarkably similar to the experience of Jews trying to escape Germany. At the same time, both Kristallnacht and Charlottesville were horrific episodes of violence motivated by ideologies of hatred. As I stood here earlier this week, I should say down the hall, in front of Kristallnacht, reflecting on these questions and reflecting on the meaning of the night, it honestly made me a little uncomfortable at times to see how the past was reflected back to me. Anyone who has been to the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington knows that their motto there is never again or never forget. And as I was reflecting in front of Kristallnacht, I was wondering if we maybe had forgotten the lessons and legacies of that evening. And I wonder if that's where the true value of Rogan's work lies. And I honestly wish right now that I had time to tell you everything that was going through my head and everything that was going through my mind as I stood there reflecting. I came about maybe 20 minutes, half an hour before I had to go pick my daughter up from the bus stop. And I thought I had more than enough time, and I realized I think I almost left her at the bus stop just because I got so absorbed in my thoughts, and I knew that if I didn't get out, I was going to get a lecture from a 5-year-old about why are you always late, why do you always have meetings. But as I stood there, taking in all the detail, and that's another thing that I want to point out, is that when you go look at the work, make sure you pay attention to the intricate detail and everything that went into putting this magnificent piece together. And I think just the intricate detail of the work is a visual symbol of the complexity of that evening. But as I kind of stood there lost in my thoughts, I honestly came up with several more ideas and things that I wanted to talk about this evening. And if you were willing to give me the time, I probably could fill the next 3 hours and then some, talking about the significance of Kristallnacht. And as you all know, if you've ever talked to me, you know that I can easily fill 3 hours and then some. However, the one thing that I kept coming back to this week, as I kept reflecting on this piece, was how it reminded me of a mirror, and how the individual pieces reminded me of pieces of a mirror. As I looked at each individual piece, it was almost as if some aspect of history was being reflected back to me. And like Rogan's description on the wall, I found myself thinking about the history of Kristallnacht, its relevance to today, and how I fit into these stories, and how I fit into all this. I started thinking about questions like, am I aware of racism around me? Do I respond appropriately? Am I personally doing the things that Rogan demands of her audience? And I'd like to think that I am, but as I stood there alone in the gallery, I started to wonder if I was doing enough, if I should be doing more, And I started wondering, how would I have responded had I been one of the people there on the night of November 1938? Those of you who know me know that I'm someone who likes to avoid conflict, likes to avoid arguments, seeks compromise. And I started wondering, were these the best qualities to have in 1938? Would this have served me well? And as I continued to reflect, I wondered, would I have actually been an uncomfortable bystander, but nonetheless a bystander? And thoughts like this, they made me a little uncomfortable as I started to think about how I fit into all this. Now, as I stood in front of Crystal Knight, thinking about how the past reflects back on the present, I kept returning to Rogan's plea for her audience not only to recognize racism, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and homophobia, but to speak out against it, especially in this current political climate. As so many of the survivors of the Holocaust said after the war, one of the most shocking things for them was how few of their friends and neighbors defended them, how nobody stood up for them despite everything that was happening. And I started wondering, what if more people in Germany spoke out against Nazi racism? What if they publicly stood up and said Nazi violence was unacceptable? Could they have prevented the Holocaust from ever happening? We saw how the regime reacted to adverse public opinion in 1938. It happened several other times, almost always involving religious issues. But whenever the regime was confronted by resistance or opposition, it backed down. It didn't continue. Thus, for me, Crystal Knight really drove home the importance of speaking out against hateful ideas and supporting people who've become targets of hateful rhetoric. Now, if you're at my address for the Alpha Chi induction ceremony a couple weeks ago, you'll remember that I ended my remarks with a request, and I'd like to do the same thing again this evening. Before you leave tonight, I ask you to go down the hall and take some time to just take in Crystal Knight. Absorb it, stand in front of it, and just kind of reflect on the meaning of the piece. And reflect on the questions that Rogan asks of her audience. And I think you'll find that the longer you stand in front of the piece, the more you'll fully appreciate its beauty and its complexity and the numbers of questions that it raises. And at the same time, if you're like me, you'll find the act of reflection to be extremely valuable, if not at times to be an eye-opening experience. So thank you. I really hope I address this because it really is an amazing piece.
Did you want?
So if you guys, I don't know if there are any questions maybe down the hall. I think Dean Rupch and I were talking that we thought it might be good to maybe move around. There's refreshments, and then also people could take in the work and see Rogan's excellent piece.
Yes, that sounds really good. Thank you.